Okay, very good.
Yeah. And so for the last 2 years, I've worked as a postdoc out of Virginia Tech on the Phlox project, which is focused on co-creating affinity groups with ornithologists for ornithologists to create a stronger sense of belonging, particularly for marginalized communities in ornithology, produce more sources of support and care, and to create more resilient scientists. When I talk about the Phlox project, I like to start with this quote from social activist Dorothy Day, who started the Catholic worker movement here in the United States way back when, I think in the 40s, that we have all known the long loneliness, and we have found that the answer is community. Isolation and loneliness is something that is felt very acutely for a lot of folks in the sciences. It is not always easy to find folks who either have shared life experiences as you if you don't look like I look. It's usually like my neurodivergence, I can kind of hide, but I can usually find my people in a room. But this loneliness, this isolation can have real severe impacts on folks' mental health, on just folks feeling like they belong in their discipline, which has downstream effects on things like productivity and retention in the sciences. And at the moment, we are seeing across the sciences broadly, multiple overlapping crises of representation. The sciences remain marked by underrepresentation of marginalized communities and of women. Stress is at an all-time high for a lot of folks. Is anyone here feeling stressed? I am. More and more of our time is being asked to do more and more stuff, while simultaneously it's becoming harder and harder to find systems and networks of support, particularly if you're coming from marginalized communities. Unwelcoming and hostile climates are driving folks who, again, don't look like me, don't present like me, out of departments, out of scientific fields. Mental health, particularly amongst grad students, and rising professional and social precarity. So we're kind of at this weird inflection point of a lot of issues that could be solved if we could find better, stronger communities. And like I mentioned, this is acutely experienced amongst marginalized communities. Women and minoritized communities are funded at lower levels, and they face more barriers during tenure and promotion. Microaggressions and cultural insensitivity abound in the sciences. And folks who are neurodivergent, like myself, and those who are living with a disability, also like myself, are paid less on average. I haven't gotten to the point of where I'm seeing that yet, so we'll see. But what this is all to say is that there is a great need for finding ways to strengthen belonging and strengthen communities of support to alleviate some of these issues that we're facing. Having an affinity group is not going to destroy microaggressions, but is going to give you a space where you can escape from them momentarily. You can find some reprieve. And like I mentioned before, these have downstream effects. This is a recent publication in the last year, back in 2024, that in Nature, that nearly 50% of researchers within a decade of earning their PhD leave the sciences. With a lot of that, women are more likely to leave than men in research as well. And we sit at a point with not only these overlapping crises in academia, but there are pretty big challenges that the world is facing that need scientists on hand. Climate change is probably something some folks in here know about. We're at a point when we need to retain the talent that we have trained to solve the big problems in society, yet we are not retaining as many folks as we could, and we're particularly losing folks from marginalized communities. And research shows that diverse research teams produce more novel questions, more diverse questions, and so we are missing out on perspectives that could really strengthen science. You can see I usually talk to a bunch of STEM folks where I have to like say why social stuff is important. And so I worked with ornithologists and those involved in bird science and bird conservation. I worked with them because folks in the ornithological community came together saying that we need stronger communities for our underrepresented and minoritized communities. And if you look at the demographics, so this is our sample versus, this is a segment of our sample that is just US based versus the US population. And other than for folks, and I'm using census designated categories for everything but these two because the census doesn't collect this information. So this is kind of a weird grouping of Middle Eastern, North African. Middle Eastern, North African, non-binary, and the broadly identifying queer community are actually slightly overrepresented or exactly represented in our sample, which is kind of an interesting finding. We're not really sure why, but across the board, Indigenous, Black, and so forth, we're seeing fewer people from those communities in the sciences. And the ornithologists that I worked with thought that this is a problem, that we need to support diversity in the field and diversify even further. And like I mentioned before, we're in an incredibly important time. In bird world, in ornithology, we're on an all hands on deck moment because since 1970, we have 2.9 billion fewer birds in American flyways. This is due to habitat loss, climate change, pollution, so on and so forth. And it's a, yes, you may record.
I would decline.
No, I'm sorry.
Someone outside.
Yeah, sorry, Emmanuel's note taker. No, nothing? No? Oh, okay. But anyways, the idea here being that if more diverse teams produce more diverse and novel ideas, then we need to make sure that everyone who is interested in bird conservation is able to participate and able to feel that they belong while they participate. I won't.
So Stephanie is going to do the admit. I just sent her a message, so hopefully
Yeah.
it won't happen again.
Thank you. Go, keep going.
And so enter the Phlox Project. Phlox Project is what I have been working on for the last 2 years, and it is a collaboration between 3 ornithological societies, the Association of Field Ornithologists, the American Ornithological Society, and Wilson Ornithological Society, and a multidisciplinary team of researchers. There's me, a geographer, we had a conservation social scientist who was my boss, and then a group of ornithologists to come together to try to figure out a way to foster affinity groups in ornithological societies to create intentional communities of care. I just like to highlight my team here. Like I said, we're a big team with my principal investigators, Thayer, who's an ornithologist out of University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Ashley Dare, who was my boss at Virginia Tech, a social scientist. Senior personnel who were our liaisons, they were more senior folks in the ornithological societies because we wanted to make sure that this was really a co-creation process where society leaders and volunteers from the community were coming together and their interactions were facilitated through our team. We had an evaluator because this is an applied project, and Anu was incredible. Anu Radhasen. She made sure that when we were making interventions that they were good, which is really, really important. And then my wonderful advisory committee, which is made up of DEI experts, as well as I was able to sneak Jack Kiesking onto, who is a geographer, and for some really key insight into building community for queer and trans communities. So what we did was we created a process that, so generally affinity groups are created through 2 ways. Either a grassroots where a community comes together and says, we want this, we're gonna make this happen. And when that happens, it's usually really centered on their needs and their experiences, but there's a lot of challenges trying to figure out where you fit into an institution, trying to get the resources, the time, and the labor to actually make it happen. There are top-down processes as well. This isn't as common in the sciences. This is more in industry through what are called employee resource groups, where an institution will literally say, I need a Black caucus because we need this community to exist, and they will create it. So a lot of that time and labor that goes into creating it is alleviated, but it's not as centered on what the community was asking for. It's what the community was told that they had to do. We are trying to bring this together. Create a process where that was data driven. I did a lot of research as part of this to pull resources from our societies, things like spaces at conferences, money, which is a big thing. We need money to make these things happen. And we especially needed money after we lost our funding. And we raised $50,000 in donations from ornithologists who wanted to see this work. So we were very excited when that happened. But we were really trying to find a way to center community needs without having to put all of the burden on them on figuring out how to make this work. We eventually recruited 37 flock leaders, and we call our affinity groups flocks because it's cute. With representation across 8 countries, all 3 societies, and our first flocks took flight in June 2025, with initially over 200 flock members within the first 2 months were recruited. We're up closer to like 250, 300 now, because once the conference season ended, there was just a kind of a fall off on recruitment because people went back to their universities that aren't paying attention to those emails anymore. And I just like to celebrate our flocks. So our first cohort of flocks were 6 flocks supporting Black identities in ornithology, the queer community, broadly Asian identities. There was a lot of discussion within that group whether or not they needed to break into 100 different little categories or just do the entire continent. And they decided that it was more effective for them to pool their labor and their voices to affect change if they all grouped together as one. Los Calibres, which is our Latin focus group, and the Supportive Association for Neurodivergence and Disability, or the Sanderlings, which is the name of these little blue clover looking birds there. And then the Flight Paths cohort, which is not around an identity. This is more of a peer-to-peer mentoring program, trying to connect graduate students with faculty who are a little bit further along in their careers. So that is what we did on the applied side. What I'm here to talk to you about is what I primarily did, which was the research. We wanted to understand what the experiences folks were having in ornithology, and we wanted to know what were the challenges in setting up and maintaining an affinity group. And so for each of those, we took a quantitative approach to survey the general membership of our 3 societies. Our sample was 1,175 respondents out of 5,000 people that we reached out to. So a really good response rate on that. And the survey is what focused on those kind of experiences in ornithology. We were asking folks about their sense of belonging. We were asking about their sense of being supported or cared for, their own personal perception of of different capacities of resilience, as well as how well the organizations were doing on DEI goals, because this was also to give information back to the organization so they could to make improvements, and on people's experiences and desires for affinity groups. We also did some qualitative work, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this low sample size here in a second, but we were able to run 2 focus group sessions with members of the Rainbow Lorikeets, which was at the time the only affinity group in North American ornithology. And they were at grassroots. They kind of sat in a space in the American Ornithological Society where they weren't quite sure how they fit in, and they had faced a number of challenges in setting up their group and maintaining it. And the focus of that was those challenges and the successes, but also on what people's experiences from affinity groups are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about findings from each of these things, trying to weave it together. We'll see how well I do. But when I'm talking about the focus groups, we're going to be talking a lot about how how the affinity group facilitated belonging and care for the population. Now, I just want to say N of 8 is very small, even for qualitative research. It is publishable. It is publishable. But at the time, that was 50% of the entire community. Because, and well, kind of. It was 50% of the community that was out. We did not want to recruit, and we didn't want to have folks in the community who were acting as liaisons for us to recruit to folks who were not officially identified with the affinity group, because then they would be getting outed to us. So we only pulled from the official community membership list, which is why that number is much lower. There are hundreds of members. It's one of the larger affinity groups that we have right now. It's just, this is what we could safely get to. So first thing I want to talk about is a little bit about is belonging. Belonging is important. I know someone in this room is studying belonging right now and doing a great job with it. But think of it very broadly as attachment to and inclusion in groups, communities, and places. It is both a social phenomena and a personal phenomena. It is my personal attachment to a place and how the social context in which I am shapes that attachment. Shaped down then by those top-down processes and grassroots connections. We looked at belonging on a disciplinary level. We asked folks about their disciplinary belonging. Do you feel that you can be your authentic self in ornithology? Ornithology is the discipline for me, things like that. Because we wanted to see how just the broader sense of belonging was shaped and changes as you look at demographic groups. So we ran some ANOVAs and found across the board that if you were not in a majority group, if you're in from a more minoritized group, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these groupings here. You are seeing, so what you're seeing on this graph here, these are box plots, but not with boxes. You are seeing the level of belonging, which was a composite score created from 5 different questions, each on a different aspect of belonging to kind of get an average sense of how someone feels that they belong in the discipline. If you were straight, you felt like you scored higher on belonging than if you were coming from the queer community writ large. If you were white, you scored higher on belonging than from all folks of color. And we had to group all folks of color because we had 8 Black respondents and 2 Indigenous respondents, and we couldn't do statistics on that small of a number. So we had to group all of our minoritized groups together, which isn't great for fine scale analysis, but it works for what we were doing here. And that same pattern happens with disability, neurodivergence, and gender. And gender, it's even more pronounced where you can really see that there's a difference between men and women, but there's even another difference between women and non-binary identifying folks. These were all statistically significant results at less than 0.001 scale. Why this is important? We asked some questions about retention. How likely are you to leave ornithology in the next 5 years? We couldn't collect data on people actually leaving because we're not doing a longitudinal study, but we were able to ask them, what are your intentions to stay in the field? And we found that the stronger someone's response was for feeling that they belonged, the less likely they are to intend to leave their field. And at a time where retention is really important in the sciences, it's always been important, but it's significantly important right now. This makes the case that we really need to focus on how do we build belonging in our scientific disciplines, and how do we build belonging specifically for folks who are feeling as though they are not belonging as much. And a lot of that idea for how to build belonging came out of our discussions with rainbow lorikeets. So I'm going to shift here to some of the qualitative data now. The rainbow lorikeets, they're now called the rainbow flock because there was always a disagreement about the name, because rainbow lorikeets, while a beautiful chattery species, are an Australian species, and it should have been a North American bird because they're North American ornithologists. So now it's a rainbow painted bunting, which are beautiful. If you get a chance to see one, you're lucky. But this group was not created from a top-down process and was not created out of our process. It developed out of conversations within the queer community, the queer community in ornithology, specifically around the need to be able to find community and have a site to amplify their voices. A lot of the folks that I spoke with felt as though it was very difficult for them to connect with anyone else who identified as queer, and it was really difficult to have a say in the societies the way it was. Like, they felt that queer issues were overlooked, not paid attention to, and not acknowledged. And so they wanted some way of concentrating their voices to be able to push back on the societies. And so I sat down for a conversation with them, and what arose out of that was just a number of kind of different ways that an affinity group could foster belonging. And I think that the simplest way is that it fosters community, right? It is an intentional community. It is set up specifically for a group of people, by a group of people. One of the respondents in the focus groups noted that just being able to be connected to other ornithologists that identify as some form of our community has just been great. It's made me feel like I didn't belong, and I didn't, but it makes me feel like I belong and I didn't before. I can't read. All those years of school didn't do much for me, apparently. And so this idea that like folks just did not feel that they belonged in that society as part of the discipline prior to the creation of this group, because it was carving out a community for them to be in. Another person even noted that I feel like I belong in the society now, despite all of its issues. The American Ornithological Society at this time had been going back and forth on having conversations about changing bird names so that it's not named after racist old white men. And there was a lot of anger in the community about that, but also just there was a sense in the community that they weren't always welcome, and this created a welcoming space. So one of the simplest ways that it helps to foster belonging is it makes a clear and present community through which one can find support. A lot of folks really hammered in how important the connections that they made with each other in those groups were, both professionally, but a lot of times just emotionally to help deal with some of the emotional difficulties for them being queer in ornithology. With one person noting that I definitely was supported by the personal connections I made, having conversations and getting advice and being able to spill my guts. Just having someone who has a similar experience, who knew what they were going through and was there to talk, was so powerful for a lot of these folks, particularly the folks earlier in their career that I spoke with. And those connections, oh, that's right, I deleted that slide. But you don't make changes the day of. As part of that connection was also this building of a sense of safety. Every year, American Ornithological Society has the Rainbow Lorikeet Sunrise Social, which every year everyone complains because it's at 6 a.m. They are birders. They get up that early anyways to go look at birds, but it's a little early. But this one person noting that, like, yeah, breakfast at him. I've never seen anything like this. I never thought I'd be feeling as safe as I am in this space. And just take a moment, like, I'm sure everyone here has a diversity of experiences. I have felt safe in nearly every working space I've been in. It is not hard for me to find safety in my work, right? When you don't feel safe, you don't feel like you can connect. You don't feel like you belong, and which again can push you out of the discipline. And this person, I had asked them a question about like comfort. They were saying comfort maybe the idea of having a space like a room where you can go to at the conference to have a meeting with other queer or ally ornithologists and be comfortable in that space. To be yourself without worries, and that providing safe spaces like that is just exceptionally important for these communities. And on safety, I like to lead into visibility after this because it's kind of tricky because hypervisibility is actually a way of creating unsafe conditions for minoritized folks. But in this space, visibility was really important for the queer community because many of them had never met another queer ornithologist. They didn't know they were there, didn't know they existed, because no one felt safe enough to be out and open about it. But this first quote is just that the existence of the group has elevated the visibility of the queer community at AOS considerably, which is incredibly important for queer folks to feel welcome, but it was also important for getting the issues facing queer community into the ears of society leadership. And a lot of folks, it wasn't even that like the affinity group did X actions. It was just the group existed and we were able to just be seen was enough to get us to be heard. Now they also run panels and things like that to educate the rest of the society on issues that they're facing. But that visibility, I think though was most important in that it helped folks to find each other. One person who has been in the field for a while was noting that they were at a meeting and a lot of folks were saying it was the first time that they had ever met another queer ornithologist. And these were people who were 65, 70 years old, who had never felt there was anything for them in that society, but had engaged with it year after year while not feeling like they belonged. Just to make sure that they're visible and we're here and there is a space, that was the most successful thing that an affinity group did. And it creates this deep sense of comfort and belonging to see people that are already established in their career becoming increasingly comfortable in being queer. And one person noted that it was like at that point they finally had a place to go, that they weren't going to be alone. So kind of the key takeaways here is that affinity groups, through increasing visibility in a safe way in this context, I'm not going to say it's always going to happen that way because everything is context dependent in these type of situations. But creating that visibility, fostering community, creating new networks of support, really fostered moments where belonging and care could come forward. And you can see I've done this talk in a bunch of different venues. You can see I'm still kind of making the thing is like we should be supporting these things everywhere all the time because they're really important for increasing not just diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging goals, but just making sure your community is supported. Like the flight paths has nothing to do with identity, and it's still providing that same benefit to everyone. But challenges remain. Burnout of leadership and transience of membership between meetings and the rapid turnover of leadership in the affinity group really hampered their ability to sustain themselves. They had a lot of difficulty just year after year making sure that the affinity group didn't collapse because they didn't have any real top-down support, which is what we're trying to fix with this co-creation process. There's also issues where members don't trust the institution and they didn't really know where they fit within the society, which kind of creates roadblocks of figuring out what you can and cannot do in that space. All right, I'm going to transition away from qualitative work now. Show one last little bit on care and how it relates to resilience. And so, as I noted, affinity groups are good at fostering belonging, and belonging, we now know, is tied to retention. So it's a good way to retain more folks. What I'm going to argue here now is that care, which is also fostered by affinity groups, is really important in how resilient an individual feels. And when I say care, I don't mean healthcare. I mean, I'm going to use this old Toronto this quote has been thrown around forever, but that is all of the actions and processes and structures that provision support, that restore us and mend our worlds or maintain them. It's really centered on interconnection and those webs of support. So the stronger a community you have, the stronger relationships you have, more likely the stronger sense of care that you're going to be getting. Once again, we wanted to see how care broke down within our demographics. And interestingly, instead of finding it across the board like we did with all of our demographic categories, folks who we did not find significant findings of a difference. So an ANOVA for a stats person is really just looking at, is there a significant difference in these things, right? Is it not just random chance? Race, gender, sexual orientation did not yield significant results, meaning that we don't really know if there was a significant difference between people of color and white folks. But we do know is that amongst folks who identify as disabled and those who are neurodivergent are statistically different, which is interesting because these box plots don't look that different, but the stats provided great results. I do want to hedge my bets on this a little bit, and our disability sample size is a little bit smaller. I would like to redo this with a larger sample and probably across multiple societies to really get a strong thing. But this is just generally folks who typically need more support networks and care are the ones who are feeling like they are not being cared for. But this is important because we found that care is really important in predicting someone's personal sense of resilience. We followed a four capacity framework for resilience put forth by Lorbeck et al. In 2022, where the transformation of institutions is central to the resilience framework. So you have these four capacities. You have absorptive capacity, which is just an individual's ability to withstand adversity by changing their behavior or relying on a social network. So in this one would be maybe having a network that you could share strategies for navigating barriers. There was adaptive capacity, which is the ability to change your own circumstances to react to adversity and harm. This could be like finding a new mentor. This could be like having an ability to shift your career into a new position and a new job. Just your ability to change the circumstance. your ability to heal after harm. So that's the restorative capacity, and this is where care is especially important. Just, do you have social networks or individual toolkits that help you to heal and restore yourself after you've felt some sort of adversity or harm? And then transformative capacity. And this is really the linchpin of this framework, that it is the ability to change underlying structures and processes of your institution to respond. So this would be able to caucus as an affinity group to advocate for change. So we ran multiple regression models, not multiple regression models, but we ran multiple regression models, looking at an overall sense of resilience, which was founded by, again, averaging a number of questions together that were all grouping together in their answers. Absorptive capacity, adaptive, restorative, and transformative. And with all of these, we've got for the social sciences, pretty strong R-squares. I know that some of the folks who are not social scientists in the room are probably looking at the R-square and like, that is pretty low. A 0.27 is actually pretty strong for a social science data set. It's not, I have my thoughts on that. But where you're seeing our strongest output, again, is with that restorative and transformative, that ability to care for yourself and ability to advocate for yourself are both very associated with care. So affinity groups can help us to foster belonging and can help us to foster care through multiple avenues. And care is a way to foster resilience. Belonging is a way to combat attrition, which makes this, I think, a really obvious answer or solution, not solution, because there are 1,000 solutions that are necessary. If you're dealing with marginalization, you have to deal with marginalization, not the symptoms of it. So yeah, like I said, I forgot to push forward. So we argue that there's a real need to develop avenue for fostering positive networks, disciplinary and society belonging, and supportive relationships. And we think that the starting point is community. We believe that affinity groups are a locus of belonging, that they carve out pockets of care, and in turn will help us to work against retention and resilience issues. A co-creation process. So our process was really, what time is it? Let's see how.
10:01.
Okay, perfect. So our process really centered on this co-creation, where we have our core project team collecting data to better understand the needs of folks in the society, giving those to volunteers who then started talking with us on like, okay, so we want to attend to this. How can we structure the affinity group to do that? And then we would take that question to society leadership and talk with them like, okay, how can we make this fit within the society structures? Because institutions are very rigid things and they don't like to change at all. We ran a workshop series where we did 3 workshops over time with the group to literally design the program with them, with us saying like, here's what we think we could do. How do you want this to work? Yeah. I think that helps to set up a lot of the burdens of setting up an affinity group because you don't have to start from scratch. One of the most useful things that I've done on this project was to create a guidebook for, it's a field guide because again, birds. It's a field guide for setting up affinity groups. It was like a little labor of love. It was a very fun thing to write. I got to write as many bird puns as I could because it wasn't a manuscript. But like, so they have documentation like that. They have workbooks to help them work through setting up bylaws. They don't have to write them from scratch because legalese is not fun to write. So just trying to figure out all the ways that we can get over those burdens of setting up affinity groups and then have society leadership buy-in to make sure that they are maintained and sustained over time. And that's actually it. I sped through. I'm sorry though. I want to acknowledge that this material was initially based on support with, by the National Science Foundation. I really want to thank all of the members of the ornithological societies who participated in this work. The AOS, AFO, and WS for giving us their time, their labor, and their resources. Those are the societies that I worked with. Obviously, my senior personnel and advisory boards, this department. I want to thank you all for having me here today. And the 200 individuals who, after our funding was pulled, supported this effort through donations. We raised about $50,000 through just generous donations from the Wilson Ornithological Society, as well as 200 folks. I'll take questions. Sorry, that was quick.
Not in room, I'll check in on the Zoom.
Dr. Levin.
I have a question, since I'm not an ornithologist, interesting research, but I'm wondering. Did most of your surveys come through the American Ornithological Society and not the others? And I'm wondering how those societies differ, like, do they have a different niche within ornithology?
Yeah, that's a great
Or are
question.
they almost all the same?
So we sent emails out to 5,000 ornithologists, and those 5,000 ornithologists were pulled from the membership lists of all three societies, and then we reduced to make sure that we weren't double dipping on anybody, so that people only got one. So when we emailed out, we didn't email specifically through American Ornithological or just through Wilson, but they had an opportunity to identify which of those three societies they most identified with, because we had a bunch of kind of evaluative questions to hand back to the societies. In terms of their difference, AOS is bigger. It's the biggest of the three. And when I say biggest, I mean, it's still conferences are only about 1,000 to 2,000 people. It's not huge, but it's bigger. AFO is the Association of Field Ornithologists is very much focused on field techs and field work. Whereas American Ornithological Society is much more like the AAG, where it's just a kind of everything, right? Wilson is a smaller society, and they have actually been moving more and more into recruiting undergraduates into ornithology through conferences, which is really interesting. But they kind of occupy a somewhat similar niche as the American Ornithological Society does. And if you go back 8 years, the American Ornithological Society was 2 separate societies that merged. So there's a lot of bird organizations, and they're all fairly small. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, most, so you'd say maybe the Wilson is probably the one that's most more of a pipeline?
It's becoming more of a pipeline, but it's also much smaller. Much smaller,
How
but
big is it?
the conference I went to over the summer, we had, I think, maybe 250 attendees. Small. And a lot of them were undergrads, and one high schooler who presented original research that was stellar.
Alright, let's hop to Zoom if Thayer.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
So Gabriella raised her hand.
Yes, thank you, Nathan, for your presentation. I have a question. Did you have did you ask this in the survey? What about the importance of the integration and economics and economics, the economic conditions, access to education, to health? Because I suppose to be able to get a job, to be able to be part of the economics of the economic system, health, education is important. So I don't know if you have faced those your participants to those questions.
We did not. On health and economics, we did not ask those questions, strangely enough. We asked questions about career stage. Are they students? Are they faculty? Are they in industry or a federal government position? So we kind of asked about what type of work they were getting up to, but we didn't ask about specifically around economic conditions, and we didn't ask about health beyond mental health and disability.
Thank you.
Yeah.
James is just applauding.
Oh, thanks, James.
I have a question for you, Nathan. I'm forgetting how all of this started. Was this a proposal that you wrote with this group of people? Or this was just happened by chance?
This came out of,
Like one that was perfectly made for you?
yes, this came out of a conversation in the DNI committee for the American Ornithological Society, where one of my PIs, Dai Shizuka, ornithologist, Nebraska-Lincoln, was just like, we need to do something. We need to diversify this field. And wrote what it was an NSF program called the BioLeaps program, which was about diversifying biological sciences. Believe it or not, it does not exist anymore, strangely. And but it came out of conversations with him and in that committee, and then him talking to someone who was a leader of the Rainbow Lorikeets, that affinity group I talked about, who then became one of my senior personnel. So this was already crafted, and I just found my way into it.
Wow.
The one fight was that I didn't have any quantitative experience, and so they were like, can you figure this out? And I think Lindsay convinced my boss that I could.
Yeah, just so they didn't hand Nathan this job, he did apply for it
Yeah,
with his credentials.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, maybe I'm so glad for your question because it sort of helps me put this in better context. I didn't realize that this was like a prepackaged question.
Yeah.
But if you could make like a longer term research agenda, would you look at things like how to educate the like an overlap, how to educate different groups, even to educate the privileged group to understand these other groups?
If I was going to make this a longer yes. I would love to help facilitate learning through the affinity groups. And that's one of the challenges with this, is that affinity groups are often tasked, maybe not officially, but implied with educating the folks who aren't in that community about their problems. Something I would love to see avoided, but is also one of the most powerful things that an affinity group can accomplish, is having voices saying like, this is what's facing my community. But if I was going to do this for a longer term, I would make this multidisciplinary. I want to see how these trends are working in ornithology and in a social science like geography or anthropology. Like, look at different places and look at societies that have had affinity groups versus ones like this one that did not, to see if there's a change over time, and just to have more comparative, because disciplines have their own cultures. And so I find it really interesting to see, like, how would climatology compare to ornithology? And are there broader things trends that we can glean from this? That would be my biggest thing. That, and trying to, my dream would be able to take our model, which we are writing a paper on, this process for it, and bring it to other societies that don't have affinity groups, and be like, yo, we have this ready-made, can we help you get this up and running? But so that's where I would want to take it. Does that answer? Perfect.
So can the field guide that you don't be used by other societies?
Anybody. I mean, there's some parts of it that are very specific, like, here's the website to find the bylaws of the American Ornithological Society. But most of it is focused on, like, how do you facilitate care in a meeting? How do you, which is hard. How do you start a meeting in a way that makes people feel like they belong? Like, questions like that are throughout it that I think are widely applicable. And that will be, it's gonna be submitted as an appendices in this one, so it will be publicly available, but I'm also getting it posted on the Virginia Tech Foundation's repository, which would make it open access for anyone to see. So once that's done, I can just make this help.
That was my next question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do they get funding,
Who?
the affinity groups, from the society?
They were originally going to, but we don't have money. So they're still working out that portion of it. Right now, we just put in budget requests with all three societies, which are very most likely going to be approved, to support some things like activities. Originally, when we had more funding, and we had planned for another round of funding from the NSF, because this was a 3-step grant program, we were going to be applying for the 3rd step at this point, where we were also to try to help travel awards and things like that to conferences, because that's one of the things that also really keeps minoritized folks out of conferences is just economic conditions, which is what Gabriella was bringing up. So who asked that question?
I did.
You did, okay.
Well, I'm just thinking
So,
about how the AAG supports
Yeah,
their
yeah,
groups.
yeah.
They don't do it through funding, but they do it through like in-kind resources, like you
Yeah,
can have
and
space on the website and you can use our,
yes,
you know, entry point to get membership fees and.
and
use-
those things are all being done.
Yeah.
So like in-kind support is happening, but all three of the societies are also carving out parts of their budgets just for the affinity groups, but that is still an ongoing conversation.
Fantastic work, really. Thank you, Nathan. Regarding the experiential component, for those of who like we do study abroad courses, do you think the fact that these are birders, that experiential pathway has something to do with fostering of care that comes in? And maybe that goes to your point about maybe comparing this with other social science affinity groups, which may be like Zoom groups or
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's an interesting question, because it's also like, one of the member of my leadership team, who's from the Rabel lorikeets, she was like, I knew there were more of us in ornithology than there would normally be. And she's like, I have thoughts as to why more queer folk are in ornithology. And she hasn't told me them yet. I'm really excited to hear them. So maybe, I'm not really sure. What I'm more thinking about with disciplinary differences is just how familiar different disciplines are with talking about social issues in science, right? Like one of the biggest barriers that we face was where folks would just say, this is not bird science. This is getting in the way of the science. Why are we having these conversations? It's like, well, because these are bird scientists who are experiencing these things. And so it's like disciplinary cultures are going to push you to have different mindsets when you're thinking about what is included in the work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Um,
But the rainbow lorikeet made me think, because, you know, that's in a very, the habitat is very close to where we used to live in Queensland. And there are these birders who come from all over the world
Oh,
just to see
them.
the
Yes.
lorikeets. And they are forced to connect with each other
Yes.
because of that.
Yeah, but I think in general, as a species, we are driven to make connections, right? And when you are when you go to work, it's no different than when you're at home. You still need those connections to survive and thrive. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
So Kanan asks, off the top of your head, what are some of the similar works you refer to for community engagement, inspiration, and motivation? Like in the literature?
Kanar, if you email me, I can send you a bibliography.
There you go. Oh yeah, Kanan's away right now.
Yeah, I can't think of them off the top of my head. We actually, I read through this book called Facilitating Affinity Groups for BIPOC, by Michelle Cassandra Johnson. Michelle Cassandra Johnson. And it's entirely on like, how do you make affinity groups work? How do you build community in institutional spaces? That might be a good place to look. So that is one answer, but if you email me, I can send you a very long bibliography of things.
So I want that paper, with the author with an F that give you the 4 different restorative.
Lehrlock.
Yeah.
You want
Oh,
that?
that's not an F, that's an L.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're on the same wavelength. There we go.
Always.
Excellent. All right.
Every day.
Good. Okay. You're like, and time for one more question. It's just the cue for no one to ask a question, apparently. Okay,
Well, thank you, everyone.
yeah.
Thank you.
This has been great.
Thank you.
I want my keys.
I do think you should take your keys.